All right, folks, and we're back. This is our last interview of the day, but don't walk away. This is going to be a good one as well. I'm pleased to welcome my friend Alan Arkatov. Alan is the Katzman Ernst Chair for Educational Entrepreneurship, Technology, and Innovation at USC's Rosser School of Education. Alan has crossed over. His history has been, actually, he started an online education initiative with UCLA, the crosstown rival, some 20 years ago when we first met. He has served on the State Board of Education in the state of California, was chair of the Post-Secondary Education Commission, does a lot of stuff back and forth, and he is now occupies this chaired professorship on the inside at a university. Alan, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Moment of housekeeping, just to remind our audience, this is the Shindig platform. We can deal with both text questions, and for those of you who have video cameras and microphones, we can probably bring you in if you have a question for Alan as well. So Alan, you as I know your
career,
career,
it sound like it came from the dark side.
No, you didn't come from the dark side. Alan, you came from the other side.
The other side.
You have worked. You spent a lot of time working with universities as trying to be a catalyst for the effective use of new technologies and new opportunities to bring more education elsewhere. I'm thinking about our early conversations about online education with UCLA Extension, some of the other conversations. You're involved with a couple of other initiatives. I know you were also involved at one point with 2U, which does online agreements and enables online learning at some institutions. You're now inside.
Yes.
You know, you have an office at USC, you have faculty colleagues as opposed to faculty and administrative clients.
Proud of it.
What's that like coming in?
It's a different ecosystem, but I think this is an unusual time. I think we're at a moment in time, an inflection point, if you would, where academia is meeting the corporate sector in important, in non-traditional ways. Right. And I think that's why I'm excited to be doing what I'm doing.
You know, Deborah Quazzo, when I spoke with her earlier today, said essentially the same thing, that, you know, when the conference started, it was essentially all technology people and all corporate folks, and they realized they needed to bring others in. There's a major effort. They've got 500 superintendents, 500 college presidents, community college folks, and others here as well, because you need to have the mix. You need to have the gumbo, if you will. And yet, part of me, because I've been doing higher ed for across 4 decades, my earliest years in admissions and then doing research and other kinds of stuff, I've heard these conversations before. We've all heard these conversations before. College costs too much. Colleges don't change. There's a great crisis in higher education. We are 10 years this year celebrating the anniversary of the Spellings Report that took higher education to task about accountability, about access and affordability. And yet, here we are, you know, confronting some of the same issues. It's kind of this, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Are we really at that inflection point?
I think we are, Casey. And part of it is actually, you set the table for this with the Campus Computing Project and longitudinal surveys over the last 20 plus years. What has changed is the technology, which you were tracking, has now caught up to where the consumer demand is such where it used to be in education that it was a supply-demand equation. And it was controlled. This is where you live, draw a 30-mile radius around where you live or work, and this is where you went to get your K-12 education, and this is where you went to get your higher education, with 1 or 2% exception fly off to the elite institutions. It's now turned to a demand side, and whether it's, we don't need to get into whether the MOOCs are good or the MOOCs are bad or small, you know, what class sizes, but technology has fundamentally altered the higher ed equation over the last few years, and I think that's why this is an inflection point. I think that's why the demand side is now driving the supply side.
Well, I think it's not just the demand side, Alan, but I think the other part is the consumer experience is driving expectations about the educational experience. In many ways, so much of what occurs in the consumer economy is now well ahead of what goes on at many campuses. That's a striking turn from where we were 20 years ago.
Huge. And I think, again, to the quality piece, the folks that are going to survive are going to be the ones that can prove quantifiably that they have better learning outcomes. And I think you mentioned a number of folks out there that are doing the high quality work. If they don't do good work, and it can't be quantified in terms of measurements, in terms of career advancement, in terms of a whole number of metrics, they will not survive. So I think in that way, higher education has had a good wake-up call, which is because of the demand, because of the heightened awareness, if they're not providing high quality and better. When was the last time you heard a conversation about improving higher education, really, across the board? And I think technology is allowing that, and I think the only companies that will survive are going to be those that can quantify that they are either doing as good, if not better, than the traditional higher education.
What about the education providers surviving? I mean, again, at the risk of redundancy, we've had these conversations about accountability, about performance, about institutional outcomes. The involvement in learning report, which very few people remember, and effectively the Department of somebody in Washington is buried, followed Nation at Risk by 4 years. So Nation at Risk was the K-12 report that said, we have shot ourselves in the foot, nobody else has done it, took us to task about the quality of K-12 education. The tone and tenor of involvement in learning several years later was much different in terms of showing a path as opposed to screaming and yelling. And yet, again, we're back here with some of these same issues in terms of accountability, affordability, in terms of student performance.
Absolutely. Access, affordability, accountability. By the way, the spirit of Daniel Patrick Moynihan is alive and well with you, Casey, as you've always been able to take the historical context and match it with the current realities. I think, again, it's the reality the market is driving in that there is the demand side is forcing universities to reckon with some business models that weren't working. Right. And I would say within 4 to 5 years, that middle tier, not the community colleges, not the top 50, 100 colleges, but I would say a good 1,000 colleges in America will either be out of business or will have had to dramatically change their business model, gone into other businesses, or really refined what they're doing. Are they a research institution? Are they a teaching institution? Are they both? Chewing gum, candy? It's all happening right now, and I think there's an urgency because, quite frankly, the business model is not working.
Okay, so let's talk about Arizona State as one part of that. I'm going to be talking with Michael Crow tomorrow. Crow has sort of pulled off effectively the trifecta: rising enrollments, rising retention and completion rates, and dramatic increases in research funding, and all under the dark cloud of dramatic cuts in state funding. Arizona has whacked higher education almost second. It's been among those who've whacked more out of higher education than a lot of other states. If you look to Arizona State as a model in terms of a rising institutional presence, a rising reputation, I want to go back to what you said a couple moments ago. How scalable and how portable is the model? Is that on the basis of the presence and the power of Michael Crow that others can do that? Where are the models that actually scale as opposed to where are those that are essentially concentrated because of a critical mass of talent, will, leadership?
Leadership there in terms of Michael Crow, quite extraordinary. Yeah. I don't think that would have just happened at ASU. We're here at GSV, ASU GSV. Yeah. He's done a number of things to change how ASU and that institution is looked at. So I think individuals, leaders matter.
He did it at a public institution with reduced, where the funding was cut. USC, where you are now, also has gone through a kind of a transformation in terms of rising. NYU has done that. If you look at NYU, you look at USC, you look at a number of institutions that are now considered to be elite but once weren't. They've done that transformation, but the privates have much more control over their destiny than does a public place like ASU.
It's a very dangerous time for the publics. And again, there's going to be a realignment that's happening. These are scary winds out there. But again, there's a little bit of desperation by some. And on the others, it's simply saying, if you look at the ones that are succeeding, they're doing it by bringing in the high-quality faculty, by bringing in new business models, whether it's a Starbucks model, et cetera. They are experimenting, and they are doing rapid cycle research in terms of what's working in terms of teaching, the classroom, and actually in the actual research environment.
There's a lot of conversation at this conference about evidence, impact of benefit, impact of outcomes, design thinking, the kind of recurring frames. The community isn't receptive to that. In theory, it should be. Operationally, it's not, whether it's K-12 or higher ed. So much of what goes on in education is by epiphany and opinion as opposed to hard evidence.
Yeah, I mean, it's an unfortunate piece. It's sort of like, in many ways, a great many of the colleges, many of those that I think will not be around in 5 years, they're the dinosaurs. And they've had their way across the land for a long time. And they're going to have to learn the hard way. But again, I keep coming back to, I know you want to, we could get into the wordsmithing, but I think the demand is going to, look at the price points. This cannot sustain. It will not sustain, not the current models. And yes, we can have students at ASU and Harvard and Penn and USC, and you can take all the various institutions doing different things and doing different things well. But the economic model does not work. So that's going to force people to change and force people to change quickly.
Does that include faculty?
Absolutely.
Okay, so again, I think about the conversations
You're going to get me into hot water now?
I'm not going to get you. I'm going to ask you to reflect thoughtfully. As an outsider who tried to be an advocate.
We're not going to talk about tenure now, are we?
We're not going to talk about tenure. But
thank you.
But
I'm going to wipe my brow.
But we are going to talk about safety, because technology is a metaphor for change, but it's also a metaphor for risk. I think about the work of Ev Rogers, who at one point was at SC. If anything, if you look at the literature about the diffusion of innovation, there is risk and there is change. And whether you're a K-12 teacher, you're a college or university professor, change does not come comfortably, and those organizations don't have a history of making it easy, making it safe, and making it comfortable for faculty and for teachers. Too often they are the targets of angst and anger, and inappropriately so. And there's a culture of data, I think it's fair to say, or there's a legacy of a culture of data, where data is used as a weapon as opposed to a resource. The conversation is you suck or you don't do this well, as opposed to how do we take data, the kind of data that you're talking about, the kind of data that emerges from big data, and bringing really thoughtful, useful information back and say, this is how we do better. This is where the path is to go forward. How do we make that safe for faculty and teachers?
It's hard. I wish there is no quick answer. Accountability done the right way. I mean, there are new tools in terms of measurements that I think faculty are looking at and embracing. There are other pieces in terms of rush to judgment, in terms of what the latest data set says, without being able to look at it in the context of 2-3 years, and being able to understand, so many variables in play. It's hard. It's complex. Higher education is hard and complex. Separating out state institutions, private institutions, independent institutions, workforce training issues, time to degree. All these are pressure points, and it's hard.
All right. We're coming into the political cycle. Okay?
There's an election?
I read this on the internet.
Okay.
All right. Without reference to party, but with reference to policy. Rare moment happens, you get candidates and their staffs and you can lock them all in a room for 10 minutes. Because you've gone back and forth on some of these policy issues in terms at state and the federal level, in terms of things that you do.
Is Donald Trump an idiot? Is he a big idiot?
No, I said I'm not talking about personalities. I'm talking about policy.
I thought Donald Trump, because Donald Trump once had a university that we would go down.
Alan, I'm talking about policy. I'm not talking about personalities.
Okay.
If you could lock them all into a room for 10 minutes and say attention must be paid, what are the 2, 3, 4 things you tell the candidates and their staffs going into the election cycle? This is where you really have to pay attention. Not for posturing, not for sound bites, but for a substantive and significant conversation about education policy in the United States for K-12 and higher ed.
Well, interestingly, and again, all joking aside, if you look at the movement behind Donald Trump and the movement behind Bernie Sanders, there is an anger, there is a frustration that government and the institutions which serve the mass, the public, have not been able to do and serve them. So the anger level, I think, a large degree is, can you access affordably the right kind of education and be able to graduate and be able to have the tool set to be able to get the kind of jobs you need to be able to put food on the table and pay for your rent. That's pretty fundamental. So I would say just look at the, feel the burn. Look at the Trump world. I think actually a lot of that is driven by a lot of education gaps that are out there. So I think the candidates, the White House, I think we have an outstanding White House in terms of the president trying to set the bar. Undersecretary Mitchell in terms of higher education, taking on really hard issues. Some of the predatory higher education players and putting things into alignment. But at the end of the day, take a look at what's going on. What's the anger that's going on out there? And a lot of it is the economics of education.
But it also seems to me that a lot of the anger is misdirected. We can have conversations about the cost and the indebtedness of students and everything else. But in fact, if we look at the rising cost of higher education, more of it lately has been driven by what's going on in the publics, because the states have whacked support. They've had their own financial problems. They've had to pay for healthcare. They've had to pay more for K-12. They've had to pay for prisons, where we're spending huge amounts of money. As I recall the numbers for California, where you and I live, we spend more for an inmate than we do for a student in the public research university, and orders of more than we do in the community colleges in terms of the state support for those kinds of issues. So there's been over a generation and a half, there's been a huge a shuffling of the deck, if you will.
We have a communications problem, Casey,
Yeah.
and for years people just thought it was their God-given right to be able to get the kind of quality education through the UCs or through all the great straight land grant universities. And there hasn't been an effective communications in terms of, it comes across as the boy that calls wolf. These universities are hurting, and they're hurting something awful, and yet the public doesn't really understand the economics of higher education. So
I think the public feels we give a lot of money to education. This is some of the anger on both sides. And kids can't get jobs. We don't know what goes on there. You can have the arguments about the sort of the political culture of these places, either way. But the larger conversation is my kid isn't benefiting the way I might have if I was fortunate to attend one of those places and now I can't go for whatever reasons. And there's not, again, to your point about communication, people think rising costs is because the universities are in control. The states are in control of a large part of that.
Yeah. So I would think, there is a communications issue.
Right.
And then again, you almost have this sort of shadow higher ed economy. So when you look at these MOOCs, quite extraordinary. Again, put aside the business model that you can take a Stanford or MIT professor anywhere in the world, or no matter what part of the world you're coming from or what economic class you're coming from, you can do it. So there are these shifting of the plates. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of noise and a lot of clutter. And I think that's part of the problem, is being able to cut through the clutter with be able to articulate. These are the budget issues. These are the education issues. And be able to mix and match for what the public needs.
All right. So hopefully one of the things that happens in the election, there's a substantive conversation about policy as opposed to it rendering down to sort of posturing.
Yeah.
That's a good point for us to end. Alan, thank you very much for joining us today. Again, I'm talking with Alan Arkatov. He is the Katz Ernst Chair for Educational Entrepreneurship, Technology, and Innovation. Do you have to do all three of those at once, or you do them one at a time?
I just do what Casey Green says, and it takes care of the rest. The rest takes care of itself.
That's very kind.
Thank you for
Alan,
having me today.
Thank you, and our audience today. Thank you all for joining us. We will begin again tomorrow, and our first up will be ASU President Michael Crow. That will be at 12:20 Pacific Time, 3:20 Eastern Time. Thanks for joining us. Send us emails. My email address is cgreen@campuscomputing.net. If we're doing well, if we're not doing what we need to do better, we'd like to hear about it before I come back into this booth tomorrow. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks again to our partners with this, eSchool Media, and to Shindig for providing the black booth that sits here at the conference and providing the enabling technology infrastructure that allows us to bring these conversations to you. We're out for the day. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.